So for this week, we have largely been looking at broad, ecosystem-based approaches. Now we will start to shift our focus towards more targeted conservation efforts, those that are directed at a single species. In this video, we will look at what a focal species is, as well as some of the most common types of focal species. Focal species are those species that warrant special management attention in biodiversity conservation planning. They are often species that are sensitive or particularly vulnerable to human activities or to changes in land use or land cover. They are also unlikely to be adequately protected by representation or other high-level core-scale conservation planning exercises. Other times, focal species are selected because the conservation of their habitat is likely to lead to the conservation of a lot of other species. Focal species play a key role in conservation planning. They help to select the locations of potential protected areas, the minimum size of these areas, and the composition and structure of the landscape to be protected. By determining the habitat area and quality needs of a focal species, conservation planners will often develop the first pass of a conservation plan. With millions of species of concern, focal species help to make conservation planning decisions easier. There are four main types of focal species. The first are keystone species, which are functionally important species that have a disproportionate effect on their ecosystem compared to their numerical abundance. Umbrella species are wide-ranging species with large area requirements, so protecting enough habitat for a viable population of them should capture the habitat needs of many other sympatric species and ecological processes. Quality indicators are sensitive species that require specific, often narrowly defined habitat conditions to survive. And flagships are species that are of economic, cultural, spiritual, or emotional importance to people, so they can be used to garner support for conservation. Let's look at each of these types of focal species in more detail. First, let's look at keystone species. Not all species in an ecosystem play an equal role. A keystone species is one that has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance. They play a critical role in maintaining the structure of their ecological community, affecting many other organisms in the system. Through their behaviors and life histories, keystone species will help determine the types and the number of various other species present in the community. Keystone species are generally top predators like sea stars and wolves, but they are really any species that has a great influence on its environment. For example, neither beavers nor elephants are top predators, but both can be considered keystone species because of how they influence their environment. The concept of a keystone species was introduced in 1969 by the zoologist Robert Paine. He compared the role that these species play in their ecosystem to the role of a keystone in an arch. Although the keystone is under the least amount of pressure of any of the stones in the arch will completely collapse without it. Similarly, when a keystone species is removed from its ecosystem, there will be dramatic changes in the composition of the system. Paine originally developed the concept of a keystone species to help explain his observations on the relationships between marine invertebrates in the intertidal zone in the Pacific Northwest. One of his study sites was consistently dominated by the same species of mussels, barnacles, and the purple sea star, which preyed upon the other two, acting as the top predator. Paine would go out and meticulously remove the starfish from some portions of his study site, and when he came back, he noticed that with the sea stars gone, the mussels, which were no longer being preyed on, took over and crowded out all other species, including the benthic algae that supported communities of sea snails, limpets, and bivalves. Missing its keystone species, the biodiversity of these sites was cut in half in just 1 year. Species that were not even the prey of the sea star were impacted. In contrast, where the sea stars were left in the community, biodiversity remained high. Umbrella species are often conflated with keystone species, as both terms describe a single species on which many other species depend. But the key difference between the two is that the value of a keystone species to conservation planning is in its function, and the value of an umbrella species is tied to its geographic range. Umbrella species have been used by conservation planners since the mid-1980s, and they have large habitat needs. In other words, a large area is required in order to support their minimum viable population. Umbrella species are focused on in conservation planning because their protection will indirectly lead to the protection of the many other species that make up the ecological community of its habitat or habitats. By protecting the range of the species with the largest habitat needs, you also end up protecting all those with smaller habitat needs in the same region. In North America, one of the most well-known examples of an umbrella species is the grizzly bear. Their needs for large wild spaces where they are secure from threats such as roads and development means that when grizzly bear populations are healthy and their habitat is well protected, about 80% of the other species that live in the same region, including elk, bighorn sheep, and whitebark pine, will also be protected. Indicator species are those that are very sensitive to environmental changes in their ecosystem, including water or air pollution and climate change. In general, they are almost immediately affected by changes to the ecosystem and are therefore able to give us an early warning sign that the ecosystem may be being degraded. All species have evolved to live within certain thresholds of environmental conditions, but indicator species can only tolerate a narrow range of certain conditions, meaning that we can use their presence as an indication of the health of an ecosystem. Frogs are commonly used as an indicator species because of their semi-permeable skin. It has to remain moist for them to breathe, but this makes them vulnerable to chemical pollutants in their environment. So the presence of frogs is usually taken as an indication of a healthy environment, and their absence is often a sign of a polluted one. Quality indicators are focal species that act like canaries in a coal mine. They give scientists early warning signs that something in the ecosystem might be off, and that area may be in need of additional attention to rectify the threat. In terms of conservation planning, by accounting for the needs of the most sensitive species, it is assumed that the needs of the more adaptable and less sensitive species will be met too. Another example of a quality indicator species are oysters. Because they are filter feeders, they are highly sensitive to changes in water chemistry. Oyster beds help protect fisheries, coastal habitats, and the benthic ecosystem as a whole, so the health of the oyster population can be used to indicate the health of the entire ecosystem. The final type of focal species we will talk about in this video is flagships. A flagship species acts as a symbol for an environmental habitat, movement, campaign, or issue. They act as a sort of mascot for an entire ecosystem or conservation campaign. Choosing a flagship species relies heavily on the social, cultural, and economic value of a species, and they are often charismatic megafauna, large animals, usually mammals, that are popular because of their appearance or cultural significance. They are often used to garner attention and support, often in the form of money, for conservation projects. From a conservation planning perspective, achieving the conservation of a flagship species can also help improve the status of many of the other species that share its habitat, similar to how the concept of an umbrella species works. However, it needs to be noted that flagships are selected for social reasons rather than ecological ones, though many of them do indeed act as keystone, umbrella, or indicator species. The World Wildlife Fund is well known for using the giant panda as its mascot to attract attention towards their work on endangered species conservation. They also have a program where people can symbolically adopt a flagship species, like koalas, tigers, lynx, or penguins. The adopter receives a plush toy version of the animal they adopt, and the money goes towards supporting WWF's conservation work around the world. Another example of a flagship species is the polar bear, which acts as the poster child for Arctic conservation and the devastating effects of climate change on biodiversity. Compared to the other types of focal species, the use of flagship species to drive conservation decision-making attracts a fair amount of criticism. Although flagship, charismatic species play an important role in the conservation ecosystem because of the amount of money that they are able to bring into organizations, they are also criticized. Although a lot of flagship species like wolves and lions are keystone or umbrella species, making them useful focal species from an ecological perspective, this isn't the case for all flagships. Concerns are often raised that by funneling conservation resources towards flagships, particularly those that do not play a key role in their ecosystem, that the limited resources of conservation are not being used to make the maximum impact towards the goal of biodiversity conservation. The argument is that a focus on flagship species can end up skewing management and conservation actions towards species that are not necessarily the best species to prioritize, to the detriment of more threatened but less charismatic species. Critics of the flagship focal species approach will often point out that charisma doesn't even seem to protect even the most charismatic species from extinction. Many of the most charismatic species, including tigers, elephants, pandas, and polar bears, are currently endangered and their populations declining. This is despite decades of being in the conservation spotlight. Some people have even suggested that their status as flagships may even be working towards their detriment, suggesting that the widespread use of images of these animals may actually be giving the public the impression that they are abundant, despite the fact that they are very much not. Most charismatic flagship species are large megafauna, meaning that there is a taxonomic bias in flagships. Large terrestrial mammals are overrepresented, and smaller mammals, insects, plants, and aquatic species are underrepresented. The final major criticism of using flagship species to drive conservation is that they are primarily used by conservation organizations in the affluent nations of North America and Europe to attract funding from affluent, mainly white donors to fund their work in less affluent nations, often in Africa and Southeast Asia. Although flagship species may be adored by people who live thousands of kilometers away from them, they are not always as well loved by the communities who live in close contact with them. If this conflict is not properly addressed, it can jeopardize otherwise well-intentioned conservation actions. An example of this is the Asian elephant, which is adored by large conservation organizations, but they are often in conflict with the human communities that live in and around their habitat. Often the money that goes towards elephant conservation ends up in sanctuaries or habitat restoration projects, but they don't always incorporate the needs of local people and the very real conflicts that they have with these animals, setting the projects up for failure, and ultimately harming both the animal and human communities. The criticisms of charismatic flagship species have led a number of conservationists to question their utility as a conservation planning and prioritization tool. On the one hand, they bring in a lot of much-needed money to conservation, but there are also questions as to how well their conservation can contribute to global biodiversity conservation. These questions have led researchers to look at whether selecting places for conservation action based solely on the presence of charismatic species could also represent broader biodiversity. In other words, they tested the effectiveness of charismatic flagships to act as an umbrella species to achieve broader biodiversity conservation goals. The results of this research has been mixed, as some studies have indicated that charismatics as an umbrella species is generally ineffective, and that there are better options for the identification of focal species. But other research has indicated that it is possible to use flagship species as a focal species. So, like most tools in conservation, flagship focal species have a role to play, they just need to be used in the right context.